The Atlantic Ocean in mid-December does not welcome a body. It dissects it. The exact fraction of a second my spine shattered the surface of the water, the extreme temperature differential instantly stripped the oxygen from my lungs. 1,000 microscopic needles of frost drove themselves into my pores, bypassing skin and muscle to lodge directly in the marrow of my bones. Above me, the blinding white halogens of the Ethelgard, Julian's 90-foot custom Benetti yacht, cut through the pitch-black water in oscillating, jagged beams. The muffled bass of the string quartet playing on the upper deck vibrated through the dense, crushing liquid. Thump, thump, thump. It resonated against my rib cage, mimicking the rhythm of a dying heart. My limbs refused to execute the basic kinetic commands to swim. For 36 months, Julian had personally handed me my daily supplements in the sunlit breakfast nook of our Georgetown penthouse. To ensure our legacy, my love, he would whisper, his lips pressing against my temple. The heavy metals disguised as bespoke fertility vitamins had done their job with surgical precision. My nervous system was now a frayed, sparking wire. My muscles, once conditioned by a four-star general's grueling training regimen, possessed the tensile strength of wet paper. I was drowning not merely because of the ocean, but because of the meticulous, chemical dismantling of my biology over 3 years. Through the churning, icy distortion of the surface, I watched the silhouettes moving frantically along the teak deck. Lily Thorne's emerald silk gown fluttered against the mahogany railing like a victory flag. She had pushed me. The kinetic force of her manicured hands against my sternum was still branded onto my skin. I didn't thrash. Thrashing accelerates hypothermia. The rapid cooling of the core body temperature forces the blood to retreat from the extremities to protect the vital organs. My military tactical training initiated a cold, analytical override to the rising panic. I conserved my failing energy, treaded water with the absolute minimum exertion required, and waited. A heavy splash tore through the surface tension 10 yards to my left. Julian, the golden boy of the Senate, the charismatic political titan who had built an impenetrable fortress in Washington on the foundation of my family's military legacy. His tailored Tom Ford tuxedo jacket had been discarded. He pierced the water with the flawless, highly efficient stroke of a man who spent his mornings doing laps in the exclusive Senate gym pool. He was swimming directly toward me. My lungs burned, acid building in my bloodstream, demanding oxygen, but a clinical detachment settled in my chest, precise and freezing. As the designated trust fiduciary overseeing my grandmother's offshore conglomerate, Julian had strict legal and financial obligations. I was the primary beneficiary of a $500 million Swiss trust. With my father, General Sterling, currently deployed and politically cornered in a highly classified operation in Eastern Europe, my sudden death was no longer a personal tragedy. It was a highly lucrative liquidation event, a hostile takeover disguised perfectly as a tragic maritime accident. The water churned violently as Julian closed the distance. The halogen spotlights from the yacht penetrated the dark waves, illuminating the sharp angles of his face. I reached out. Now my fingers, numb and pale as submerged alabaster, broke the surface. I waited for the firm, saving grip of the man who had sworn an oath to me before 500 of Washington's elite. He swam right past my outstretched hand. The slipstream of his powerful forward movement created a micro vortex in the water. It pulled me slightly toward him, only to leave me drifting helplessly in his wake. He didn't swim to me, he swam to Lily. Lily, who had strategically slipped into the freezing water moments after pushing me, ensuring she remained safely within reach of the yacht's illuminated swim platform. The acoustics of the ocean surface broke for a fraction of a second as my head breached the crest of a wave. "She is a sinking ship, Julian." Lily's voice cut through the freezing air, sharp, metallic, utterly devoid of the frantic panic expected of a drowning woman. "Her father is dead. Her family's political capital is completely drained. Let her go." Julian's arms wrapped securely around Lily's waist. He hoisted her toward the teak platform where crew members were already reaching down. His jaw was set tight, his profile carved from absolute sociopathic pragmatism. "Grab my hand, Lily," Julian instructed, his tone as steady and modulated as if he were ordering a martini at the Capitol Hill Club. "Do not look down." He didn't need to look down. He knew exactly where I was. Our eyes locked through the dark, churning water. The searchlight swept over us, freezing the moment in brilliant white clarity. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no flicker of remorse, just the dead, calculating stare of a corporate spreadsheet balancing to zero. Then came the physical execution. Julian braced his custom-made Italian leather loafers against the submerged fiberglass hull of the yacht. He needed leverage to push Lily upward to safety, but the trajectory of his legs was deliberately, mathematically angled. He kicked backward. The kinetic force of his powerful thrust transferred directly into the water. A dense, concussive wave of freezing Atlantic brine slammed squarely into my face. The sheer physical impact of the water forced my jaw open. Salt and the bitter, suffocating taste of boat engine exhaust flooded my trachea. The kick physically shoved me downward, breaking my fragile buoyancy, collapsing my lungs. I swallowed the ocean. The water above me smoothed over, sealing the breach. The bubbles escaping my lips were perfectly spherical. They caught the beams of the yacht's searchlights as they drifted upward, abandoning me to the dark. Above the surface, the cheers vibrated down through the fiberglass hull. "They are safe. We have them." The applause of high society, celebrating the survival of my murderers. The heavy velvet of my designer coat absorbed the salt water, transforming from a garment into a leaden shroud. I was dragged down into the crushing abyss. The cold ceased to register as pain, morphing instead into a terrifyingly lucid numbness. My father's pristine reputation, my inheritance, my life, all meticulously stripped, repackaged, and transferred to the golden boy of Washington. The blinding white light of the yacht shrank to a halo, then a pinpoint, and finally absolute black. The hydrostatic pressure in my skull reached a crescendo. A sharp, snapping sound echoed in the void. The metallic rhythm sliced through the silence. My eyes snapped open. There was no freezing water, no suffocating pressure. My lungs expanded violently, sucking in dry, climate controlled air smelling of aged mahogany and lemon oil. I was sitting upright in a high backed leather chair. Across the room, the antique grandfather clock in the Sterling Estate Library swung its brass pendulum. My gaze locked onto the digital display of the Bloomberg terminal on the desk. December 10th. Exactly 96 hours before my father's fatal convoy ambush. The digital numerals on the Bloomberg terminal burned a vibrant, accusing crimson into my retinas. December 10th. I dragged a hand across my collarbone. No water, no freezing Atlantic current, just the crisp, starched cotton of a bespoke blouse. The air conditioning hummed, a low, sterile vibration that contrasted sharply with the roaring ocean still echoing in my skull. I was sitting at the polished mahogany desk in the Sterling Estate Library, surrounded by the suffocating luxury of old money and military heritage. 4 days. Exactly 96 hours before the classified Black Ops convoy carrying my father, General Sterling, and my brother would be decimated in a carefully orchestrated ambush in Eastern Europe. The door to the library swung open with a soft, weighted whoosh. "Serena, darling." Eleanor Vance stood framed in the doorway. She wore a pristine Chanel suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the aggressive elegance of a woman who wielded social invitations like shivs. Her presence was a meticulously calculated intrusion. She wasn't just Julian's mother, she was the architect of the Vance family's political ascendance. I remained seated, the cold leather of the chair grounding me, the physical memory of Julian's Italian loafers kicking me deeper into the abyss surged through my veins. The hypothermia had vanished, replaced by an absolute freezing clarity. "Julian tells me you've been unwell," Eleanor began, stepping onto the Persian rug. The sharp click of her heels was a rhythmic assertion of dominance. She approached the desk, pulling a thick, cream-colored document from her Hermes Birkin bag. It landed on the mahogany with a soft, authoritative slap. "This is the prenuptial agreement, Serena. We need your signature today. Julian's campaign is gaining momentum, and we simply cannot afford any uncertainties regarding the Sterling family's political capital." I looked down at the document. It was the same trap, perfectly laid out, exactly as it had been. The agreement was ostensibly a standard protection of assets, but buried within its dense legalese was a comprehensive power of attorney clause. It effectively granted Julian absolute control over my grandmother's Swiss trust and full discretion over the Sterling Pack funds the moment we married. It was the financial garrote that would slowly choke the life out of my family's legacy. "Uncertainties," I repeated, my voice lacking the tremulous anxiety she expected. Eleanor smiled, a tight, patronizing stretch of her lips. "A girl with your aggressive military upbringing needs the Vance family name to be civilized in Washington, Serena. Sign the endorsement papers. Julian is your future now. We are your family." The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She was standing in my home, demanding the keys to my empire, believing I was nothing more than a fragile, grieving heiress, desperate for the stability of the Vance name. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, thick and uncomfortable. My gaze drifted from the prenuptial agreement to the corner of the room. Standing next to the fireplace was a set of vintage golf clubs, my father's prized possessions. I stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate. I bypassed the desk and walked toward the fireplace. Eleanor watched me, a flicker of confusion breaking her polished facade. "Serena, what are you doing? The pen is on the desk." I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold, textured grip of a 9 iron. The club weighed exactly 420 grams. The balance was perfect. I swung it slightly, feeling the aerodynamic slice of the metal through the air. "Civilized?" I asked, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. I turned back to face her, the club resting casually against my shoulder. "Let me show you how civilized the Sterlings can be." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. Her gaze darted from my face to the iron club. "Serena, put that down. You are acting erratically." I held my ground. My gaze was lethal. I deliberately lowered the head of the golf club to the floor. The library was paved in flawless, imported Italian Carrara marble. I began to walk toward her. I didn't lift the club. I dragged it. Screech! The heavy iron head ground against the polished stone. The sound was excruciating, a high-pitched metallic shriek that set my teeth on edge and sent violent vibrations up my arm. Sparks spit from the friction, tiny, brilliant flashes of orange and yellow illuminating the space between us. Eleanor stumbled backward, her composure shattering instantly. "Have you lost your mind?" I kept walking, my pace steady and unhurried. Screech! The iron dug a shallow, jagged trench into the priceless marble. "You want my signature?" I demanded, the metal grinding against the stone. "You want the sterling name to legitimize your son's pathetic campaign." Eleanor bumped against a mahogany side table. Perched atop it was a Ming Dynasty porcelain vase, a piece acquired by my great-grandfather, valued at $50,000. It was an exquisite, fragile thing, much like the image the Vances tried to project. I stopped dragging the club. I lifted it smoothly, the kinetic energy flowing from my core, through my shoulders, and down the shaft of the iron. "Serena, no!" Eleanor shrieked, throwing her hands up to protect her face. The swing was clean, a perfect arc honed by years of practice on the driving range. The heavy iron head connected with the delicate porcelain, a sickening, hollow crack. The vase didn't just break, it exploded. A cloud of fine white dust and jagged shards of blue and white porcelain erupted across the room. Shards rained down on the Persian rug, scattering across the marble floor with a chaotic, clinking cacophony. A large, jagged piece ricocheted off the wall and skittered to a halt inches from Eleanor's custom-made heels. The aftermath was devastating. I let the head of the club rest on the floor again, right amidst the shattered ruins of the vase. I looked at Eleanor. Her face was ashen, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with raw, unadulterated terror. She wasn't looking at a grieving, malleable heiress anymore. She was looking at a predator who had just been unchained. "Tell Julian," I commanded, my voice cold and lethal in the dusty air. "The wedding is off. Tell him if he or anyone from his pathetic family sets foot on sterling property again, I will not be swinging at porcelain." Eleanor scrambled backward. She didn't even grab the prenuptial agreement still lying on the desk. She turned and bolted for the heavy mahogany double doors, her frantic footsteps echoing down the hallway. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of her retreat was an absolute triumph. The first chain was broken. The Vances would not touch a single cent of the sterling empire. I dropped the golf club. It hit the marble with a heavy clatter. I walked back to the desk and opened the top drawer. I reached to the very back and pulled out the satellite phone. The digital clock on the Bloomberg terminal flickered. 9:14 a.m. The countdown had officially begun. I had less than 4 days to dismantle an ambush planned by the highest echelons of Washington power, and I needed resources that Julian hadn't yet bled dry. I flipped open the phone and punched in a 13-digit international number. It rang twice before connecting to Geneva. "Identify." A sterile, automated voice demanded in German, "Sterling Serena, authorization code, Valkyrie 7 Echo Niner." I stated firmly. The system processed the data. "Identity confirmed. Welcome, Ms. Sterling." I stared at the shattered Ming vase on the floor, the jagged edges sharp enough to draw blood. Transfer $50 million from the primary trust to the numbered account associated with Aegis Defense. I ordered aloud, projecting absolute authority. I need to buy an army, and I need them deployed in 72 hours. The digital confirmation screen on the encrypted satellite phone flared a brilliant, sterile green. Transfer complete. $50 million. The transaction was executed via an untraceable wire transfer through a web of offshore shell companies. I bypassed the standard banking protocols that Julian would undoubtedly monitor. He thought he controlled my access, but the Geneva Trust wasn't tied to the sterling political empire. It was my grandmother's personal contingency fund, locked behind a retinal scan biometric protocol that only I possessed. It was ghost money. I snapped the satellite phone shut. The heavy click echoed in the silence of the library, mingling with the metallic ticking of the grandfather clock. 95 hours remaining. My father, General Thomas Sterling, was a decorated veteran, a man whose tactical brilliance was legendary in the Pentagon corridors. He was also a man too honorable to suspect treason from within his own ranks. Julian had played the loyal future son-in-law perfectly, embedding himself in the general's inner circle while secretly leaking the coordinates of the classified Black Ops convoy to enemy combatants. Julian's motive was sickeningly simple. A martyred General Sterling meant a tidal wave of sympathy votes and an untethered, grieving heiress to control. I needed to move fast. The 50 million was just the deposit. I needed the man who commanded the ghosts, Xander Pierce, heir to the Pierce global conglomerate, but more importantly, the founder of Aegis Defense, a ruthlessly efficient private military company, PMC, that operated in the shadows where conventional armies couldn't tread. He was a billionaire, a predator, and the only man in Washington who despised the political establishment as much as I currently did. I didn't bother packing a bag. I grabbed a sleek titanium briefcase from the hidden safe behind a false panel in the study. Inside, resting alongside a stack of high-denomination bearer bonds, were the classified satellite images and encrypted communication logs I had intercepted and decrypted from Julian's private server during his business trips. The drive to the covert airstrip in rural Virginia took 45 minutes. The rain had turned into a freezing sleet, lashing against the windshield of my armored SUV. The airstrip was deserted save for a single matte black Gulfstream G650 idling on the tarmac, its engines emitting a low, powerful whine. The landing lights cut through the sleet, casting long, dramatic shadows. I stepped out of the SUV, the freezing wind whipping my hair. I didn't flinch. The cold was a familiar, necessary grounding force. Xander Pierce stood near the nose of the aircraft, leaning casually against the fuselage. He wore a tailored dark overcoat that absorbed the minimal light, his posture relaxed but coiled with latent energy. He watched me approach, his dark eyes assessing the titanium briefcase in my hand with clinical precision. "Serena Sterling," Xander said, his voice a low baritone that competed with the jet engines. He didn't offer his hand. We weren't here for pleasantries. "You're off the grid, and you wired $50 million to a ghost account 3 hours ago." "I need an extraction," I said, stopping a few feet from him. "A highly specialized, completely off-the-books extraction." Xander raised a brow, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking his composed facade. "You want me to pull a VIP out of a hot zone? Who?" "General Thomas Sterling, my father." The silence stretched, broken only by the sleet hitting the tarmac. Xander's eyes narrowed. "Your father is commanding a classified operation in Eastern Europe. He has the full backing of the U.S. military. Why would he need Aegis?" "Because his own military is going to let him die." I hoisted the titanium briefcase and slid it smoothly across the sleek, wet hood of the SUV. It stopped exactly inches from Xander's hand. The metallic friction sounded sharp and deliberate. "Open it," I commanded. Xander snapped the latches open with a sharp clack. He flipped through the bearer bonds without interest, his focus immediately dropping to the satellite imagery and the decrypted logs. I watched his eyes scan the documents. His expression remained impassive, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his realization of the magnitude of the betrayal. "The supply route for Sector 4 is compromised," I stated, my voice steady and cold. "The support convoy carrying ammunition and medical supplies has been deliberately delayed by orders originating from the Senate Armed Services Committee, specifically from Julian Vance." I pulled out a small encrypted audio player from my coat pocket and pressed play. The tinny, intercepted voice of Julian Vance crackled through the freezing air. "Julian, General Sterling's convoy is routed through Sector 4. The supply trucks are delayed. It's a clean sweep. You'll have your martyr, and I'll have my Senate seat." The voice belonged to Lily Thorne, her tone laced with arrogant complicity. I paused the recording. "Julian wants a martyr," I said, staring directly into Xander's eyes. "I'll give him a massacre." Xander didn't blink. He slowly closed the briefcase, the metallic snick echoing loudly. He looked from the case to me, assessing not just the intelligence, but the woman delivering it. He saw the cold, calculated detachment in my eyes, the exact opposite of the fragile heiress Julian had paraded around Washington. "The terrain in Sector 4 is a death trap," Xander said, his voice analytical. "A rocky gorge, no cover. If they're ambushed there without supplies, it's a slaughter. Which is why you need to be there before they are. I have the exact coordinates and the precise time of the ambush, 92 hours from now." Xander tapped his fingers rhythmically against the titanium case. The sleet was beginning to accumulate on his shoulders. 50 million covers the deployment," he said slowly, "but this is an act of war against a sovereign state, and technically treason against the U.S. government if we interfere with a sanctioned operation. I don't care about the politics, Pierce. I care about the extraction, and I have another 50 million waiting when my father steps off this tarmac." Xander smirked, a dangerous, predatory curve of his lips. He didn't ask for guarantees. He recognized the absolute certainty of my resolve. He snapped the briefcase shut completely. "Wheels up in 20," Xander ordered, turning toward the Gulf Stream. "I'll have my operators briefed by the time we hit cruising altitude." "I'm not going," I said, my voice cutting through the engine noise. Xander paused on the first step of the air stairs, looking back at me with a raised eyebrow. "You're paying $100 million for a rescue op, and you're not going to oversee it? If I disappear, Julian gets suspicious. I need him comfortable. I need him to believe his plan is working perfectly right up until the moment it explodes in his face." I turned back to my SUV. The freezing rain plastered my hair to my cheek, but I didn't brush it away. "Bring him back, Pierce, alive." "Consider it done, Sterling," Xander replied, disappearing into the aircraft. I climbed into the SUV and locked the doors. The heavy thud of the lock sealing me inside was a stark contrast to the roaring jet engines outside. I watched the Gulfstream taxi down the runway, its navigation lights blinking rhythmically until it lifted off, vanishing into the sleet and darkness. The extraction was in motion. Now I had to ensure Julian's domestic empire began to crumble before the news even hit. My phone buzzed on the center console. The screen lit up with a name that made my blood run cold, then hot with anticipated vengeance. Julian Vance. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing. forcing my heart rate to a steady, calm rhythm. I picked up the phone, swiping to answer. "Serena, darling," Julian's voice oozed through the speaker, smooth and dripping with fabricated concern. "My mother said you were unwell today. She mentioned something about a broken vase. Shall I come over?" I stared at the blinking red light on the dashboard, my expression frozen in a smile he couldn't see. "You should," I replied, my voice perfectly modulated, a flawless imitation of a devoted, distressed fiancé. "We need to talk about the campaign funds, Julian. There's been a complication." Julian arrived at the Sterling estate exactly 42 minutes later. The heavy brass knocker on the front door resonated through the foyer, a sound that, in my previous life, signaled the arrival of my supposed savior. Now it was the sound of a parasite demanding entry. I didn't answer the door. I let the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, usher him in. I remained seated behind my father's massive, commanding oak desk in the library. The shattered remnants of the Ming vase had been meticulously swept away, leaving the pristine Carrara marble unblemished, a silent testament to Eleanor Vance's humiliating retreat. The air in the room was intentionally kept at a crisp 68 degrees. I wanted him uncomfortable. The door opened and Julian strode in. He was the quintessential Washington golden boy, impeccably tailored navy suit, a tie knotted with mathematical precision, and a smile that had secured him millions in campaign donations. It was a smile engineered to disarm, to reassure, and to deceive. "Serena," he murmured, his voice laced with practiced sympathy. He crossed the room, his eyes scanning my face for the fragility he so desperately relied upon. "My mother said you were distressed. The pressure of your father's deployment, it's taking a toll, isn't it?" I looked up from the glowing screen of the laptop. The interface was secured, currently displaying the internal dashboard of the Sterling Political Action Committee, PAC. I was the sole remaining signatory with immediate, unrestricted access to its liquid assets. "I've been thinking about the future, Julian," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremulous anxiety he expected. I didn't offer him a seat. Julian halted a few feet from the desk, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his polished features. He glanced at the empty space where the Ming vase used to stand, then back at me. "The future is what we make it, darling. Once we are married, I can alleviate this burden for you. The Sterling legacy needs a strong, steady hand in Washington." He stepped closer, resting his manicured hands on the edge of the oak desk, leaning in. The scent of his Tom Ford Owdwood cologne, a fragrance I once associated with comfort, now registered as the cloying stench of rot. "You've been under a lot of stress, Serena," Julian continued, his tone shifting into a patronizing, authoritative cadence. "Let me handle the Sterling PAC funds for the upcoming quarter. We need to maximize our media buy before the primaries. You just focus on resting." He was reaching for the financial jugular. The Sterling Pats held over $12 million in liquid capital, a war chest amassed through decades of my father's military and political alliances. It was the lifeblood of Julian's impending Senate run. Without it, he was merely a charismatic junior congressman with a mountain of debt. I kept my eyes locked on his. My right hand hovered over the laptop's trackpad. "You're right, Julian," I said, a terrifying calm settling over me. Julian's smile widened, relief and triumph washing over his face. He thought he had won. He thought the momentary rebellion with his mother was just a hysterical outburst. "I knew you'd see reason," he whispered, reaching across the desk to cover my hand with his. I pulled my hand back before he could make contact. The physical rejection was swift and absolute. I looked back at the screen. The interface required three distinct confirmations to execute a mass transfer of this magnitude. Click 1, select all funds. The digital numbers highlighted in blue, $12,450,000. Click 2, designate recipient. I bypassed the Vance campaign accounts and selected a heavily vetted nonprofit organization dedicated to veterans rehabilitation, a cause my father genuinely championed. The funds have been handled, I stated clearly. Julian frowned, a crease appearing between his perfectly groomed eyebrows. Handled? What do you mean? I haven't authorized the transfer to my campaign manager yet. We need to comply with FEC regulations regarding large-scale donations. Click 3. Execute transfer. The screen refreshed. A satisfying sterile progress bar filled from left to right. Then a green check mark appeared. Transaction complete. Remaining balance $0. I didn't need to say another word. The timing was impeccable. Julian's phone, resting in the breast pocket of his suit, buzzed violently. It was a rapid, frantic succession of alerts. He pulled it out, annoyed by the interruption. He glanced at the screen, expecting an update on his polling numbers or a message from Lily Thorne. I watched the exact moment his world began to fracture. His pupils dilated. The color drained from his face with staggering speed, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened. The charismatic facade crumbled, replaced by naked, unadulterated panic. He was staring at an urgent red flagged message from his campaign finance director. The routing numbers he had painstakingly set up to receive the Sterling Pack infusion were pinging back fatal errors. The account was empty, the money was gone, $12 million, evaporated in milliseconds. He looked up at me, his breath hitching in his throat. Serena, what did you do? I secured my family's legacy, I replied coldly. I opened the top drawer of the desk. I reached inside and pulled out the velvet box containing the 4-carat, flawless diamond engagement ring he had given me. It was a ring bought on credit, an investment he expected to recoup 100-fold once he controlled my assets. I didn't hand it to him. I didn't throw it at him in a fit of rage. I held the ring between my thumb and forefinger. On the desk sat a heavy, lead crystal ashtray, currently holding the gray, powdery remnants of a cigar my father had smoked a week prior. I opened my fingers. The diamond ring fell, hitting the crystal with a sharp, resonant clink. It nestled perfectly into the cold, dead ash. Get out of my house, I said. My voice wasn't raised. It was a quiet, absolute command. It held the weight of a military tribunal handing down a sentence. Julian stared at the ring in the ash, then back at me. He was paralyzed. The cognitive dissonance of seeing his compliant, fragile fiancé orchestrate a $12 million financial execution was short-circuiting his brain. Serena, you don't understand, he stammered, his voice rising in panic. The campaign, the media buys. I have commitments. You can't just move that money. We have agreements. Your commitments are your problem, Congressman, I said, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. My only commitment is to the Sterling name, and you are no longer a part of it. You're being hysterical, Julian shouted, slamming his hand on the desk, his panic morphing into desperate anger. You don't know what you're doing. You're ruining everything. I didn't flinch. I reached under the lip of the desk and pressed a concealed button. Within seconds, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Two massive, imposing private security contractors, men my father had personally vetted, stepped into the library. Their posture was rigid, their hands resting near their holstered weapons. "Escort Mr. Vance off the property," I ordered, not taking my eyes off Julian. "If he resists, use force. If he returns, arrest him for trespassing." Julian looked at the guards, then back at me. The realization that he had absolutely zero leverage finally hit him. He was standing in my fortress, surrounded by my men, having just lost his entire political war chest. He didn't say another word. The humiliation was total. He turned on his heel and walked out, his posture stiff and defeated. The security contractors followed closely behind, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floors. I listened to the heavy front doors open and slam shut, sealing him outside in the freezing rain. The house was quiet again. I looked down at the diamond ring resting in the ash. It was a cheap, vulgar symbol of a life I had narrowly escaped. I picked up my secure satellite phone. I didn't need to wait for Xander's update. The gears were turning. Julian's financial starvation had begun. Tomorrow, the physical annihilation of his political career would commence. Outside, standing in the freezing, relentless downpour, Julian Vance frantically dialed a number on his burner phone. His hands shook as he pressed the device to his ear. "Lily," he gasped, his voice trembling with raw desperation. "The pack is gone. She drained it, but as long as the general's convoy hits that gorge at 0600 hours tomorrow, we still inherit the military backing. We just have to survive until tomorrow." Tomorrow was 0 hour. The air in the Kresnik Gorge was thin and smelled of cordite and diesel exhaust. The temperature hovered at 10 degrees below freezing. General Thomas Sterling, a veteran of 4 distinct theaters of war, crouched behind the bullet-riddled engine block of an overturned Humvee. Beside him, my brother, Captain Liam Sterling, was reloading his M4 carbine with numb, blood-stained fingers. The tactical situation was a mathematically certain disaster. The promised logistical support, a convoy carrying heavy munitions, medical supplies, and reinforcements, had simply vanished from the satellite uplink. Julian Vance, leveraging his position on the Senate Armed Services Committee, had issued a seemingly routine road reassessment order 12 hours prior. The delay was fatal. The enemy combatants, a highly organized local militia armed with stolen Russian weaponry, occupied the high ground on both sides of the gorge. General Sterling's unit was pinned down in the kill zone. The relentless brrrt of heavy machine gun fire echoed off the canyon walls, kicking up geysers of snow and frozen earth inches from the general's helmet. "Where is the air support, sir?" Liam yelled over the cacophony, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. "We're running dry. The birds were supposed to be here 20 minutes ago." General Sterling didn't look at his son. His eyes were fixed on the ridgeline, calculating the exact moment the enemy would initiate a final, overwhelming assault. He had spent his entire life commanding men, understanding the grim calculus of sacrifice. He recognized the stark reality: they had been set up. "Hold the line, Captain," General Sterling ordered, his voice a gravelly, authoritative rasp that betrayed none of the impending doom. "Conserve your ammo." At 5:58 a.m., the militia launched their coordinated push. Hundreds of armed men began pouring down the steep, snowy inclines of the gorge, their war cries echoing in the freezing dawn. The remaining U.S. forces braced for the impact, returning fire with disciplined, desperate precision. Then the acoustic signature of the battlefield shifted, a deep, Rhythmic thrumming sound began to vibrate through the frozen ground, cutting through the crackle of gunfire. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of approaching enemy armor, it was the heavy, unmistakable wub, wub, wub of rotary blades. General Sterling glanced at the overcast sky. 5 unmarked, matte black MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters crested the eastern ridge in a tight, aggressive formation. They carried no U.S. military insignia, no identifying transponder signals. They were ghosts. The helicopters didn't circle for reconnaissance. They banked sharply, diving directly into the gorge. Before the militia could adjust their fire toward the sky, the Black Hawks unleashed absolute, unadulterated hellfire. The deafening roar of 7.62 millimeter miniguns mounted on the sides of the aircraft tore through the freezing air. Tracers lit up the dim morning light like continuous, deadly laser beams. The enemy positions on the ridge lines were obliterated in seconds, the snowy slopes erupting in geysers of pulverized rock and bodies. "Who the hell is that?" Liam shouted, ducking as a hail of spent brass cascaded from the helicopters passing low overhead. General Sterling watched the synchronized, utterly ruthless efficiency of the aerial assault. He recognized the tactics, not standard U.S. military doctrine, but the brutal, hyperkinetic engagement style of highly paid, elite, private contractors. The Black Hawks hovered in a defensive perimeter, continuing to lay down suppressing fire while the lead chopper descended rapidly toward the overturned Humvees. The side doors slid open, revealing men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas and night vision goggles. A thick, static-laced voice crackled over the general's encrypted comms unit. It wasn't standard military encryption, it was a private frequency. General Sterling, courtesy of Aegis Defense, your daughter sends her regards. We have exactly 3 minutes to get you and your men out of this kill zone. Washington, D.C., 6:15 a.m. I sat in the sterile, heavily fortified war room deep within the Pentagon. The walls were lined with massive digital displays rendering global troop movements, satellite feeds, and tactical maps in cool, glowing blues and reds. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. The top brass, 4-star generals, the Secretary of Defense, and key intelligence directors were clustered around the central briefing table. The silence was heavy with the anticipated confirmation of General Sterling's demise. Julian's sabotage had been seamless, buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape. I was the only civilian present, granted access solely due to my status as General Sterling's immediate next of kin. They expected me to break down. They expected tears and hysteria when the inevitable loss of signal report came through. Instead, I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the polished mahogany table. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. I wasn't watching the military's compromised tactical feeds. I was looking at my secure satellite phone, resting face down next to my coffee cup. On the largest screen, CNN was broadcasting live. Julian Vance stood at a podium outside the Capitol building. He looked perfectly disheveled, no tie, his collar open, dark circles expertly applied under his eyes by his makeup team. He was delivering a masterclass in fabricated grief. "We are monitoring a deeply troubling situation in Eastern Europe," Julian intoned, his voice rich with practiced sorrow. "General Thomas Sterling, a true American hero, and his unit are currently unaccounted for following a massive enemy ambush. We are awaiting the tragic confirmation of his unit's status." Julian paused, bowing his head slightly, letting the camera capture the faux devastation on his face. The news tickers at the bottom of the screen were already running breaking news banners. General Sterling feared dead in ambush. I picked up my satellite phone. The screen displayed a single encrypted green check mark from Xander Pierce. Extraction successful. Packages secured. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the floor drew the confused stares of the generals in the room. I ignored them and walked directly toward the secure communications console at the head of the table. "Miss Sterling, please," a high-ranking officer said softly, attempting to guide me back to my seat. "This is incredibly difficult, but we need you to—" I didn't answer. I slammed my hand onto the main console, overriding the internal mute protocols, and established a direct, encrypted comms link to the CNN studio's live feed, a backdoor access I had secured via my father's top-tier clearance codes weeks prior. On the massive screen, Julian was still speaking, and in these dark hours, we must remember the sacrifices made for our freedom. I leaned into the microphone. My voice, amplified and broadcast directly into the live CNN feed, echoed through the Pentagon War Room and millions of American living rooms simultaneously. "No need to wait, Julian," I said, my tone as cold and sharp as a scalpel. Julian froze mid-sentence. The CNN anchor beside him looked startled, tapping his earpiece in confusion. I picked up the satellite phone and placed it directly against the Pentagon microphone. I hit the speakerphone button. "My father is on line 1. The deafening silence in the CNN studio was shattered by a booming, furious voice echoing through the static of a secure satellite connection. It was unmistakably General Thomas Sterling. He didn't sound like a martyr. He sounded like a man who had just walked through hell and found the architect. "Vance, you son of a bitch!" My father's voice roared, raw with adrenaline and absolute fury. The sound vibrated through the television speakers, obliterating Julian's carefully constructed narrative. "I'm coming home." Julian dropped his prepared script. The papers scattered across the podium, fluttering to the ground. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly, terrified white. He stared into the camera lens, his charismatic facade totally shattered. The golden boy of the Senate looked exactly like what he was, a traitor caught red-handed on national television. The CNN anchor scrambled to cut the feed, shouting for commercial break, but the damage was irreversible. In the Pentagon War Room, the generals erupted into chaos, shouting for confirmation and demanding to know how a presumed dead general was currently broadcasting on CNN. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I turned off the microphone, picked up my satellite phone, and walked out of the war room. The heavy blast doors sealed shut behind me. Julian stumbled away from the CNN podium, hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically as reporters began shouting questions. He shoved past a cameraman desperate to reach his waiting SUV, but as he reached the curb, two men in dark, conservative suits stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, blocking his path. Their badges caught the morning light. "Congressman Vance," the taller agent said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, "the FBI would like a word regarding your offshore wire transfers and unauthorized communications with foreign entities." Julian Vance's world did not end with a bang. It ended with a systematic, agonizing suffocation over the course of 48 hours. The CNN broadcast was merely the initial strike, a surgical severing of his political armor. What followed was a masterclass in total, comprehensive ruin, orchestrated from the sterile, high-altitude sanctuary of a penthouse overlooking the Potomac. I sat before a bank of curved monitors, the glow of financial data illuminating my face. My posture was relaxed, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I was currently commanding. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is a volatile, inefficient fuel. What I felt was a cold, precise satisfaction, the kind a surgeon feels when excising a malignant tumor. Julian had built his empire on the perception of wealth and the promise of future power, much of it implicitly tied to my family's name and assets. Now that foundation was gone, replaced by a gaping, terrifying void. The first phase of the suffocation began with the physical assets. I picked up a secure landline. Execute the asset freeze on all joint accounts and secondary credit lines associated with Vance. I instructed the senior partner at my grandmother's wealth management firm. Immediately, Ms. Sterling. The voice replied, efficient and unquestioning. I watched the digital confirmation roll across my screen. The trap was set. Julian was bleeding out financially, and he didn't even know it yet. He still believed he had a safety net, a hidden reservoir of funds amassed through his illicit dealings and kickbacks from defense contractors. He was wrong. That evening, Julian attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. He attended a high-profile fundraiser at the Kennedy Center, a desperate bid to reassure his rapidly panicking donors that the morning's misunderstanding on CNN would be swiftly resolved. He arrived in a chauffeured town car, projecting an aura of aggrieved dignity, claiming a tragic miscommunication had occurred regarding General Sterling's status. I was not in attendance, but I had eyes everywhere. My encrypted feed buzzed with real-time updates from a private investigator I had embedded among the waitstaff. Subject Vance is at the bar, attempting to purchase a round of Macallan 25 for Senator Hastings and his key contributors, the message read. I leaned forward, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. This was the moment. Julian, flashing his signature 1,000-watt smile, handed his sleek, titanium American Express Centurion card to the bartender. The bartender, a seasoned professional accustomed to the extravagant whims of Washington's elite, swiped the card through the terminal. The transaction should have been seamless, an invisible transfer of thousands of dollars. Instead, the terminal emitted a sharp, humiliatingly loud electronic beep. The bartender frowned, attempting to process the card again. Another beep, louder this time, cutting through the subdued murmur of political gossip and clinking crystal. I'm sorry, Congressman, the bartender said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the surrounding dignitaries. The card has been declined. Julian's smile froze, turning brittle and strained. The blood drained from his face for the second time that day. He snatched the card back, his hand trembling slightly. That's impossible. Try it again. It must be a glitch. The bartender, maintaining a painfully polite demeanor, gestured to the terminal. I've tried it twice, sir. The issuer is indicating a complete freeze on the account. Senator Hastings, a key donor whose support was crucial to Julian's Senate run, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. The humiliation was palpable, thick and cloying in the air. Julian's power was an illusion, and the illusion had just shattered in front of the very people he needed most. I watched the live feed on my monitor, the text detailing the exchange. I didn't smile. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. The coffee was bitter and rich, perfectly mirroring the taste of Julian's defeat. He fumbled for another card, a platinum Visa. Declined. A debit card? declined. Every financial artery connected to him had been severed. The fundraiser, meant to be his salvation, turned into a public execution. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. Julian Vance was insolvent. He fled the Kennedy Center less than 20 minutes later, his tailored suit hanging off him like a shroud, his political career effectively dead. The second phase of the suffocation targeted his accomplices. Lily Thorne, the disgraced DC lobbyist and Julian's co-conspirator, was not a woman who panicked easily. She was a survivor, a parasite adept at detaching from a dying host and finding a new one. But she had severely underestimated the scope of my retaliation. From my penthouse, I accessed the dark web portal established by the team of elite hackers I had hired. Their instructions were clear: monitor and intercept all of Lily Thorne's financial movements. Lily, sensing the impending collapse of Julian's empire following the CNN debacle and the rumors of his insolvency, was executing her escape plan. She sat in her luxury apartment in Dupont Circle, frantically typing on her encrypted laptop. She was attempting to move $5 million, funds acquired through her illicit lobbying efforts and Julian's kickbacks, to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. "She's initiating the transfer, boss," a voice crackled through my encrypted headset. "She's using a convoluted routing protocol, bouncing it through 3 different shell corporations." "Stop her," I commanded, my voice flat and devoid of urgency. "Burn the Swift code authorization, ensure the funds bounce back to the origin account, but flag the transaction for immediate review by the Department of Justice." "Executing now." I watched the live capture of Lily's screen on my secondary monitor. She was sweating, her perfectly manicured fingers flying across the keyboard. She clicked the final authorize button. The screen displayed a loading icon, a spinning circle that represented her entire future. She exhaled a shaky breath, whispering a prayer to whatever god parasites worshipped. Then the screen abruptly went black. The spinning circle vanished, replaced by a stark, glowing red skull logo, the calling card of my hacker collective. Below it, in bold, unforgiving letters, a single sentence appeared: "Access denied by Sterling Trust. Funds frozen, pending federal investigation." Lily stared at the screen, her mouth opening in a silent scream of disbelief. She pounded the keyboard, desperately trying to refresh the page, to bypass the block, to salvage the millions she needed to disappear to Monaco. It was futile. The digital walls had closed in. "Julian is a dead man walking," she muttered frantically, grabbing a burner phone from her desk. "But with this 5 million, I can disappear." "Monaco is lovely this time of year," I whispered, though she couldn't hear me. "Too bad you'll be spending it in a federal penitentiary." At the exact second she threw the burner phone down in frustration, the heavy, reinforced steel door of her Dupont Circle apartment exploded inward. Boom! The sound was catastrophic, a concussive blast that shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows and sent shards of glass raining down on the Persian rugs. The heavy oak door was ripped from its hinges by an FBI battering ram, splintering wood flying through the air like shrapnel. A team of heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear poured into the apartment, their assault rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the settling dust. "FBI, get on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" The lead agent roared, his voice amplified and terrifying. Lily Thorne, the untouchable lobbyist, the woman who had pushed me into the freezing Atlantic, shrieked in sheer terror. She dropped to the floor, cowering amidst the shattered glass and splintered wood, her designer dress covered in dust. Two agents hauled her roughly to her feet, slamming her against the wall to cuff her. The sharp, metallic clack of the heavy federal handcuffs tightening around her wrists echoed through the devastated apartment. I watched the chaotic scene unfold on the security camera feed I had hijacked earlier that day. The satisfaction was profound, a dark, heavy weight settling comfortably in my chest. Lily was dragged out of the apartment, kicking and screaming obscenities, her dignity stripped away entirely. She was being hauled off to face charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The final phase of the suffocation was purely psychological. Julian sat in his dark, unheated town car, parked 3 blocks away from Lily's apartment building. He had watched the FBI raid unfold, seeing the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet asphalt. He saw Lily dragged out in handcuffs, sobbing hysterically. He knew he was next. He was completely isolated. His accounts were frozen. His political career was annihilated. His co conspirator was in federal custody. He had no money, no allies, and no escape route. He pulled out a cheap burner phone, his hands shaking violently. He dialed a number he had sworn never to use, a contact provided by a cartel linked loan shark he had crossed paths with years ago. It was a desperate, suicidal move, but he was a drowning man grasping at razors. The phone rang twice. Then a voice answered. It wasn't the gravelly, accented voice of the loan shark. It was a smooth, chillingly calm baritone. "Congressman Vance," Xander Pierce said, his tone dripping with lethal amusement, "I believe you're looking for a loan. Unfortunately, your credit rating has suffered a rather severe downgrade recently. The interest rates are astronomical." Julian dropped the phone. It clattered against the floorboards of the town car. He stared blankly into the darkness, the realization crashing over him with absolute crushing finality. He hadn't just lost a political battle, he had been systematically, comprehensively dismantled by the woman he had tried to murder. Julian stumbled out of the car, hyperventilating, the freezing rain soaking through his expensive suit. He broke into a frantic, pathetic sprint, desperate to reach Dulles Airport, hoping to charter a flight, any flight, out of the country before the FBI found him. But as he reached the edge of the tarmac, gasping for air, he saw two figures waiting for him in the shadows of a private jet. Serena Sterling and Xander Pierce stood side by side, their silhouettes sharp against the runway lights, waiting to deliver the final blow. The freezing rain at Dulles International Airport tasted of jet fuel and desperation. Julian Vance stumbled across the rain-slicked tarmac, his breath tearing through his lungs in ragged, visible plumes. His bespoke Brioni suit, once the armor of a Washington Titan, was plastered to his skin, heavy and sodden. He clutched a leather overnight bag, the only possession he had managed to salvage from his Georgetown penthouse before the FBI froze the electronic locks. Inside were a few remaining bearer bonds and a forged passport. It was a pathetic, panicked exodus. He was aiming for a private Gulfstream 4 parked at the far edge of the runway, a charter he had secured through a labyrinth of shell companies hours before his accounts were entirely zeroed out. The aircraft's engines whined, a low, powerful hum that promised escape, promised a sanctuary where the treason indictment couldn't reach him. I stood in the shadows of the Gulfstream's massive wing, perfectly shielded from the relentless downpour. Xander Pierce stood beside me, his presence an imposing, impenetrable wall of dark wool and lethal intent. We watched Julian run. He was a rat scurrying through a maze we had designed, convinced he was nearing the exit, oblivious to the fact that the maze had no doors. Julian's Italian leather loafers slipped on the wet asphalt. He went down hard, his knee striking the ground with a sickening thud. He scrambled back up, his face contorted in a rictus of sheer panic, his pristine image entirely obliterated. As he neared the air stairs, the Gulf Stream's powerful halogen landing lights snapped on, blinding him. He threw a hand up, squinting through the glare and the rain. "Start the engines!" Julian screamed over the roar of the turbines, his voice cracking with hysteria. "We need to leave now!" He didn't see us until we stepped out of the blinding light and into his direct line of sight. Julian froze. The leather bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the puddles with a dull splash. The absolute, unadulterated terror in his eyes was exquisite. It was the look of a man who had finally realized he was standing at the edge of an abyss, and I was the one holding the match to the bridge. "Going somewhere, Julian?" I asked, my voice barely raised above conversational volume, yet it carried clearly over the engine noise. The clinical detachment I felt was absolute. I was not looking at my former fiancé, I was looking at an infestation that was about to be eradicated. "Serena," he gasped, his chest heaving, rain mixing with the sweat and dirt on his face. You can't be here. The flight, the manifest, the flight manifesto," Xander interjected, his tone laced with dark amusement, "was remarkably easy to acquire. As was the pilot. Turns out Aegis Defense pays significantly better than a disgraced, bankrupt congressman." Julian's eyes darted frantically toward the cockpit. The pilot, a man he had paid a small fortune an hour ago, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, an Aegis operative, fully kitted in tactical gear, stood in the doorway of the aircraft, a suppressed rifle resting casually across his chest. The trap was hermetically sealed. "You can't do this," Julian stammered, stepping backward, his hands raised in a pathetic, placating gesture. "I am a United States congressman. I have immunity. You have no authority to hold me here." "I don't need authority, Julian," I said, stepping closer. The stiletto heels of my Christian Louboutin boots clicked sharply against the wet tarmac, a sound that cut through the engine whine like a metronome counting down his final seconds of freedom. "I just need evidence." I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a thick, sealed dossier. The weight of it in my hand was immense. It contained the decrypted communication logs, the offshore wire transfers, and the irrefutable proof of his coordination with foreign combatants to sabotage my father's unit. It was the physical manifestation of his treason. Suddenly, the perimeter of the airstrip erupted in a chaotic symphony of sirens and flashing red and blue lights. A dozen federal cruisers tore through the access gates, their tires screeching on the wet asphalt as they formed a tight, aggressive semicircle around the Gulf Stream. The blinding strobes illuminated the rain, painting Julian's horrified face in alternating flashes of crimson and cobalt. The doors of the cruisers burst open simultaneously. Heavily armed agents from the FBI and the Department of Defense poured out, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at Julian. "Julian Vance, get on the ground, hands behind your head." The commanding roar of the lead federal agent echoed across the tarmac, amplified by a bullhorn. Julian's knees buckled. The reality of his situation crushed whatever remaining defiance he possessed. He didn't just kneel, he collapsed into the freezing, jet fuel slicked mud of the runway, his bespoke suit absorbing the filth. He curled into a fetal position, his hands trembling violently as he laced his fingers behind his head. "You can't do this!" Julian screamed into the mud, his voice raw, pathetic, and entirely broken. "I am untouchable. I am a congressman. You can't—" I walked up to the lead DOD investigator, a grizzled man with a face carved from granite. I handed him the dossier. "The evidence regarding Congressman Vance's treason indictment and his coordination in the ambush of General Sterling's unit," I stated, my voice as cold and precise as the sleet. "The extradition protocols for his offshore assets are also included." The investigator took the heavy file, his eyes sweeping over Julian's thrashing form before meeting mine. "Thank you, Miss Sterling. We'll take it from here." I turned back to Julian. Two massive federal agents hauled him roughly from the mud, twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clack of heavy federal handcuffs tightening around his wrists was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute, irreversible justice. "You're not untouchable, Julian," I said, looking down at him. My pulse remained perfectly flat. "You're just uninsured." Julian thrashed against the agent's grip, his eyes wild, spit flying from his lips as he screamed my name. "Serena, you ruined me. I will kill you." He lunged forward, a desperate feral movement. As he did, his sleek $1,000 iPhone slipped from his pocket, landing on the wet asphalt between us. I held my ground, unflinching. I simply lifted my foot and brought the sharp, steel-reinforced stiletto heel of my boot down directly onto the center of the screen. Crunch! The Gorilla Glass shattered instantly, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact. I ground my heel into the device, twisting it slowly, feeling the internal components break and warp under the pressure. The screen flickered violently, emitting a dying, jagged spark before going permanently black. I was severing his last connection to the world, obliterating his ability to call in favors, to manipulate, to spin his narrative. The phone was dead, and so was he. I stepped over his struggling body, leaving the crushed remnants of his phone in the mud. The agents dragged Julian away, his expensive mud-soaked suit dragging against the asphalt. They shoved him roughly into the back of a heavily armored black transport van. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a concussive thud. His frantic screams were entirely cut off. The aftermath was profound, broken only by the idling jet engines and the relentless storm. I stood on the tarmac, the cold wind whipping my hair. The heavy, dark satisfaction settled in my chest, replacing the icy void that had been there since the moment I broke the surface of the Atlantic. Xander stepped up beside me. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He understood the gravity of the moment, the sheer, undeniable magnitude of what had just been accomplished. "It is over," I declared, my voice cutting sharply through the storm. Xander reached into the pocket of his overcoat and retrieved a sleek, silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and offered it to me. "No, Serena," Xander replied, his dark eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the departing federal cruisers. He took a slow, deliberate sip from the flask, the metallic scent of aged whiskey mingling with the jet fuel. "We are just getting started." I took the flask from Xander, the cold metal biting into my palm. I watched the taillights of the armored van carrying Julian Vance disappear into the storm. My father was alive. My enemy was annihilated. But as the adrenaline receded, a new, sharper realization took its place. Washington was a city of predators, and by taking down one of its own, I had not just survived the game. I had just rewritten the rules. The real war was about to begin. The panoramic view from the 84th floor of the Sterling Tower presented Manhattan not as a city, but as a sprawling, illuminated circuit board. 6 months had passed since the freezing rain at Dulles Airport. The ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado had officially processed inmate 84729-014, formerly known as Congressman Julian Vance. His treason indictment had been swift, brutal, and televised. The 25-year sentence without the possibility of parole was a testament to the airtight dossier I had personally handed to the Department of Defense. Lily Thorne's cooperative testimony regarding their wire fraud operations had earned her a 10-year stint in a federal penitentiary, a slightly more comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. I sat on a sleek, stark white leather sofa, the kind that cost more than a senator's annual salary. The climate control maintained a perfect 68 degrees. Across the expansive, minimalist living room, my father, General Thomas Sterling, stood by the floor to ceiling windows. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid, bearing only a slight stiffness in his left shoulder from the shrapnel he had taken during the Eastern European ambush. He was fully recovered, his reputation not only intact, but elevated to the status of a living legend. The military establishment, reeling from the scandal of Julian's betrayal, had closed ranks around him, solidifying our family's political capital beyond anything Julian could have ever manipulated. The massive flat screen television mounted on the opposite wall played a muted CNN broadcast. The ticker at the bottom scrolled relentlessly. Former lobbying firm Vance and Associates acquired by Sterling Global. I wasn't watching the screen. My attention was fixed on the dense, leather-bound portfolio resting on the glass coffee table in front of me. These were the final acquisition papers, the complete, hostile liquidation of Julian's remaining domestic assets, repackaged and absorbed into the Sterling conglomerate. I was legally dissolving his legacy, erasing his name from every corporate registry in Washington and New York. Xander Pierce emerged from the kitchen area, carrying two heavy Baccarat crystal tumblers and a bottle of Macallan 25. He moved with the silent, predatory grace that defined him, his dark suit blending into the evening shadows. He set the bottle down on the glass table with a soft, authoritative thud. "It's finalized," Xander said, his voice a low, resonant hum. He didn't ask. He stated a fact. He knew the intricate machinery of the corporate slaughter I had orchestrated as intimately as he knew the tactical deployment of his Aegis contractors. "The board approved the restructuring an hour ago," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline that thrummed beneath my skin. I reached for the heavy, solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen resting beside the portfolio. As I unscrewed the cap, the metallic friction was a sharp, satisfying sound. I thought back to the yacht, to the freezing, suffocating blackness of the Atlantic. Flashback voiceover, Julian's voice echoing in my memory, cold and pragmatic. "She's a sinking ship, Lily. Let her go." My anger was completely gone. Anger was for the weak, for those who lacked the resources to exact precise, calculated vengeance. What I felt was a profound clinical detachment, a dark, absolute satisfaction. I brought the gold nib of the pen to the thick, textured parchment of the final signature page. The weight of the pen was exactly 42 grams. The nib touched the paper. A deliberate, irreversible incision. I watched the dark blue ink bloom across the page, my signature, Serena Sterling, flowing in elegant, aggressive strokes. legally obliterating the last vestige of Julian Vance's existence in the corporate world. The heavy scratch of the gold nib was the final nail in his coffin. I capped the pen and let it rest on the document. The trap was dismantled. The pieces melted down and reforged into my own armor. I looked up at the television screen. The broadcast showed Julian being led into a federal transport van in a bright orange jumpsuit, his charismatic smile replaced by a hollow, terrified stare. He looked incredibly small. I picked up the sleek aluminum remote control. My triumph was absolute. Gloating was unnecessary. The execution was complete. I pointed the remote at the screen and pressed the power button. With a definitive electronic click, the massive screen went instantly black. He was gone, erased. The atmosphere in the penthouse was charged, filled by the ambient hum of the city below and the pouring of aged whiskey. Xander handed me a crystal tumbler. The amber liquid swirled, catching the golden light of the setting sun. "To the new empire," Xander declared, raising his glass. His dark eyes held a dangerous, shared understanding. We were no longer just allies forged in crisis. We were architects of a new power structure, a power couple in the truest, most ruthless sense of the word. My expression remained stone. I met his gaze, the cold satisfaction settling deep within my core. I raised my glass. The sharp, musical clink of baccarat crystal echoed in the cavernous space. It was the sound of absolute, unbreakable power. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the Macallan. It tasted of victory and limitless ambition. My father turned from the window. He offered a brief, approving nod. The sterling legacy was not just secure, it was weaponized. I stood up, holding my glass, and walked to the floor to ceiling windows. The city spread out beneath me, a glittering grid of wealth and influence. I had been pushed into the abyss, and I had returned to drag my murderers down into it. But I was not finished. The game had merely evolved. I looked out over Central Park. The air in the penthouse was charged with kinetic energy. I had reclaimed my life, my name, and my power. And from this altitude, everyone else just looked like a target. I took another sip of the whiskey. My phone vibrated against the glass table with a single encrypted message from an unknown number. I picked it up, my eyes narrowing as I read the text. Julian wasn't acting alone. The Senate Armed Services Committee has a leak. Check the offshore accounts linked to Senator Hastings. The corners of my mouth curved upward in a cold, predatory smile. The real war was just beginning.